Before I talk, I want to show a very, very short video of my daughter, Mila. I think it's a reminder of why we're all here. She is a child, and she is my child, and she's not a statistic or a number, but she is one of 200 million children that have rare genetic diseases, and the reason we're all here today. So we'll start with that.
Sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray.
So our daughter's name is Mila Virginia Makovitz. She was born on November 5th, 2010. When I think about Mila as an infant, I think about smiles and laughter and health. And
half an hour after she was born, she was strong enough to hold on to my finger, and I could almost pick her up off the bed.
When Mila was a toddler, she was a climber, she was a hiker, she was a runner.
How old are you, Mila? Here's our sugar high daughter.
Side, side, side.
Very physical, always loved to ride a strider,
Nice, bug.
play in the snow, go sledding.
Coming!
We noticed that Mila was getting stuck on her words. She would say, "Mommy, Mommy, I have to, Mommy, I have to," and not be able to continue. And then suddenly, around 3 years old, we started noticing that her feet were slightly unturned and she was walking strangely. And then at 4 years old, we noticed that she pulled books in close. And then around 5 years old, Mila's feet started moving really quickly in this strange pit-pattering way, and then she would fall back on her butt. And every time she stood up, she would fall back and stand up and fall back. You know, we took her around to different doctors who never could really kind of figure out what was going on with her. And then time passes, and then in just 1 month, everything can change. She could no longer see anything. What's brought her so much happiness is playing with her toys and or looking at her books and watching TV and playing with her brother, and suddenly it looked like she could no longer play with anything. It's so hard to see such a outgoing little girl not be able to play with other kids and not be able to play with toys and not be able to watch Elmo anymore.
And years ago, this year, my daughter was diagnosed with a rare, 100% fatal genetic disease. She had been completely typical, healthy, outgoing, center of attention. She was skiing, rock climbing. She was, riding her little bike. And then suddenly she started having one problem after the next. Sometimes she would trip and fall and be covered in bruises. Other times she'd be able to walk perfectly. She would see when we were hiking like a flower and pick it up and look at the detail, and other times she wouldn't see a deer crossing the path. She started stuttering and would start sentences and say 3 or 4 words and get stuck. So after 2.5 years and 100 visits to doctors and therapists around the US and into Canada, I brought her to the emergency room and gave up. And she was diagnosed with a rare form of an already very rare condition called Batten disease. Batten, Seal, and 7 had like 25 children in the world at the time. And just from 1 minute to the next, I was told that my daughter was going to lose all of her abilities except for hearing, and she was going to die in the next few years. I looked at my little daughter at the time, who was rapidly losing her vision, and her world was getting darker by the day, and she was laughing and smiling and like full of joy. And I just said, if she's fighting, I'm going to fight. And that meant reading white papers, which I knew nothing. I had no understanding of genetics or lysosomal storage diseases or Batten disease. Talking to doctors and scientists around the world, meeting with other parents, incredibly inspired by the fact they'd started foundations, raised millions of dollars, only to learn at the end of their discussions that all of their children had died, and they were still fighting. That was a really pivotal moment in my personal life. And so I started a foundation. I started telling my daughter's story to anyone and everyone. I wanted to cry on the floor of my closet, but instead I let media people into my house and eventually realized that the only way I was going to raise the money that was needed to potentially create a new treatment for my daughter was telling the story of devastation and hope, which was the real story of my life. I ended up raising a lot of money and working with doctors at Boston Children's Hospital because there was a little problem in my daughter's diagnosis, which is it's autosomal recessive, and they could only find one of the two mutations. So in my quest at the time, 10 years ago, to get whole genome sequencing, which was expensive and also took a long time, I ended up meeting Dr. Timothy Yu at Boston Children's Hospital and was very, very fortunate to be able to have he and his team fight alongside me for my daughter. That started by looking for her missing mutation. And they did finally find her missing mutation, which was very unusual. At the time, Spinraza had just been approved for spinal muscular atrophy, another horrible, horrible disease in little children who die very young. And antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs, were on everyone's mind in this lab in Boston Children's Hospital. The difference was that Spinraza was for a population, a large, rare disease of tens of thousands. And in the case of my daughter, not only was she one of 25 kids at the time, but she had a very unique mutation with an already small disease, and she was the only person in the world to have that mutation. I was extremely lucky that this team of people saw my daughter rapidly declining, and they said, if we can make this ASO and we can show in independent labs around the country that it is restoring health to her cells, which they did, why would we not bring this medicine to her? And I was incredibly fortunate that they pushed back all the naysayers that said, you can't do this. This has to be a medicine for a large group of people. But it was only for her. So in a very Herculean effort with, honestly, dozens, I would say even hundreds across academic institutions and hospitals, companies, they raised the money, they did the science, we teamed up and worked with the regulator and really had a very compelling ethical and scientific argument. And a year later, even though I was told that we were 10 years away from stopping this disease, a year later I moved to Boston. My family and my daughter began receiving what was named after her, an ASO called Mila. I didn't know at the time until that day that my daughter would become the first person in the world to receive a medicine for one person, and in many ways would open up an entirely new field of individualized medicines. Since then, there have been 100 children have received individualized ASOs, and more recently, an individualized CRISPR with baby KJ, as many of you have seen. This medicine was incredible. To be honest, I hadn't had a second to think about what the effect would be because I knew the risk of not treating my daughter was inevitable death. The risk of treating her was something a lot less than that. And I knew that she could die on the spot. This was a new medicine, but I didn't spend more than 1 second thinking about that because I knew what she was up against. In the first year, it stopped my daughter's disease. She had, in that year leading up to this medicine, she had lost her vision. She lost her last words and said, "Mommy," for the last time. She started having 20 to 30 seizures a day that lasted 2 minutes each. She had a G-tube put in and was no longer able to eat by mouth. That all happened in 1 year. So she was degenerating as if she were a very sick 100-year-old, and she was 6. After Milicin, her seizures pretty much disappeared. That's what Dr. Yu published on in the New England Journal of Medicine. She had maybe 1 or 2 that lasted 1 second, like a little head twitch. That was it. She started eating by mouth again. It was not perfect. It was pureed foods, but she got to actually taste food and not have it put through a tube into her stomach. She was smiling and laughing much more when I told her fantastical, crazy stories of the adventures of Mila Bug, which she loved. And she was more alert, lifting her feet better. This all lasted a year. But unfortunately, as we all know too well, children like my daughter are being found too late and treated too late. And too many genetic dominoes had already fallen at that point. So 3 years into her treatment, Mila died. And I like to say her big spirit left her little body. And I talk in front of people all the time for years, and it still feels like I'm talking about someone else's life. But my story is unfortunately not unique. I'm one of hundreds of millions of parents and probably tens of millions that lose their children in childhood. The reason that I'm still here on the stage talking is that, what my daughter's story showed is that, it wasn't in time for her, but it showed what's possible now, that we have incredible science. This has been the theme of today at this meeting, is we have unbelievable science and technology, but the system evolved or was designed, however you want to say it, for large populations. And the problem is, the reality is that genetic diseases are not large. There are some that are, and there's an awesome feeding frenzy on medicines for those few dozen diseases. But there are 10,000 diseases that are small, and my daughter's is just one of them. And it affects 200 million children worldwide. So I don't understand why people are not speaking about this as a massive global health crisis. It's huge. But that's great to just, it's great to say that it's a global health crisis, but how do you get today's incredible technology and science to these tens of millions of children? It made me stop and think, what's the barrier here? How do we scale what Dr. Yu and I did so that parents don't have to sell lemonade and cookies and raise millions of dollars, and clinicians don't have to drop everything they're doing for 1 to 2 years and create a team of dozens of people and a 1,000-page regulatory, IND in the U.S. To save one dying child? That's not going to work, right? And going one disease at a time, one approval, one medicine at a time it's not my opinion, it's just a fact, it's logical, is we cannot go one disease at a time anymore if we're going to capture, and help these tens of millions of children. And when I went through this process with many others, I was fortunate to be working with many, many people across this field over the years. It seemed that we have heard, starting with Sam, we've heard this from everyone today, is that science isn't the limiting factor. It means quite the opposite of science not being the problem. Science is the solution, and we have incredible science out there. There is no bridge between, I live out west in the US, so the Grand Canyon, you have tens of millions of Milas. And then you have this city booming on the other side of technology that are therapeutic modalities and delivery mechanisms and all the cutting edge stuff, but there is no access for these children. There's a highway bridge that says, stop, you can only go across if you're part of a very large commercially viable disease. And then there's this little tiny bridge that I'd like to believe I helped make with, duct tape and I don't know what, with like one person going off over at a time. And it's compassionate use, one-off, Hail Marys by a scientist and a crazy mom, and it's not ethical, it's not sustainable, it can't be done. We know how many times it can be done. In 8 years, it was done 100 times. And while that's really exciting, it's not, because there are millions of people that could benefit from today's technologies. And so when you think about the system, what is that? It's primarily regulatory and reimbursement, or business model. And that's what brought me to the UK 3 years ago. I tried in the US. I was grateful to the FDA for putting out many guidances after Mila was treated. But they were not commercially viable, they were not scalable, and so I came to the UK. And together with Parker Moss and Dan O'Connor and many others in this room, we started something called the Rare Therapies Launchpad. And the purpose of that was to first say, do we need a new system to fit the reality of genetic disease? And I got a lot of nodding heads from the MHRA, from NHS England, from Oxford, Harrington, and others. And then the second was, how many times can we talk about this? I've been doing this for 10 years, and honestly, it's harder, longer, and more expensive for children to access treatments than it was for me 8 years ago. I'm like, that's not okay. And so, the status quo is just not working. So you put on human mom hat, and it's like huge unmet need. You put on business hat and say, huge untapped market. So the question is how do we link the two? And I believe that it does need to be a commercially viable path. These cannot be one-offs every single time. We need to have an incentive for biotech companies to work with hospitals so that when we find a child, they can commission an individualized medicine, whether or not that medicine is for 1 or 7 or 40, it doesn't matter, right? And what I found is that the regulator, at the time Dan O'Connor was there, now obviously things have changed, and we have Lawrence Talon at the helm, who's really incredible. And I really believe that the UK is going to be the place that's going to prove first and foremost what we need, which is we cannot go product by product. We cannot have one approval for one medicine for one disease. It will be here in 3,000 years. So we need to move from product to process approval. And there's a lot that we've learned in the Rare Therapies Launchpad of other areas that we can pull from namely surgery and transplants, where there's already a very highly individualized approach. So in many ways, Millicent fell in a no man's land between traditional drug development and stem cell treatments, transplants. There are some other precedents that are out there. And so how do we get there? Rare Therapies Launchpad one company included was my own that I had started. There were no other people crazy enough to start a company with individualized medicines because there was no appetite from investors to take more than a risk on molecule, which they're willing to, but not on regulatory or reimbursement. And the idea was to bring a master protocol trial, which we did through the Rare Therapies Launchpad, to the MHRA and say, what if we did a trial that crossed different diseases, different mutations, different medicines, but keeping the entire development process the same? The patients are all fatal, life-threatening, monogenic conditions in children, using ASOs of the same chemistry, so keeping everything the same, swapping out the medicine. And we got approval for that by this MHRA under Lawrence Tallon last fall, treated the first patient early this year. Unfortunately, my investors decided to then close the company afterwards because, unfortunately, the regulatory path is not open yet and provides an additional barrier to scaling this. I am just as determined as ever, and I've already started another company, and I'm putting all my eggs into the UK. Why? Because I really think that under Lawrence Tallon and the MHRA that we are working with right now, including Julian Beach and others that are about to put out, as you've heard, a really important new regulatory path for rare diseases in the next week or so. We'll see that I think the UK is going to be one that's going to demonstrate how the system changes, how we capture those patients. We still have to capture a lot of patients together, but instead of capturing vertically by one disease at a time, can we capture horizontally across diseases? Where you have a child like Mila has a splice mutation, so do thousands of others that are amenable to a splice modulating ASO. Can we recategorize patients and can we capture them in larger groups in a different way that are commercially viable, that allow for a biotech to exist and work with Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is what we did. Work hand in hand, and then that helps the regulator as well not have to see a line of 1,000 versions of me waiting outside their building, which they will never be able to handle. So I would say I think that the UK is going to be where this happens, thanks to many of you here, including LifeArc, who has the perfectly aligned vision that science is here and we need to change the system. If we are successful, then we put a system in place here in the UK, and others around the world look to the UK and use that as a blueprint. And children are found at birth, and they are treated soon after with a highly precise, individualized medicine that's likely much more effective than others. And these children and their families never know what life with disease looks like because the disease is stopped before it comes on. If we are not successful, it means that we should all be ashamed because we have the science and technology to help families like mine not have to hold their children dead in their arms. That is the kind of call I receive like every week, is how to find a small white coffin, whether parents should take their lives or not, okay? This is happening by the millions, and we have the science to help. So what happens if we don't put this system in place is that millions of children die, even though they are amenable to today's technologies, and that is just not acceptable. So we have a pressure to change our mindset. We're gonna have to do things differently. It's just what it is. So I will stop there, and I would like to show one more video. I don't normally do this. This is the first time I'm showing this. My campaign is Mila to Millions. It's been years that I've been saying this. How do we scale this? And I want to show that this is not just about Mila. My daughter is just one child, but she represents many others. And in my foundation, we've done a photojournal for the last 6 years with a professional photographer who's incredible, and followed the end of my daughter's life and then the lives of dozens of others that have children with different rare genetic diseases. And we've put together a very short video just to remind all of us really why we're here. The music is by Rare Disease Dad, who's with us today, Casey McPherson, who is a professional musician and now turned biotech founder and CEO. And his daughter is affected and amenable to today's technologies as well. So if you don't mind playing this, I'd like to end here.
It's hard to see through all the rain. I'm smart and young, with the world of pain. How can I be where you are? Maybe my heart's the thing I crave. Maybe my lows are just too hard to shake. There's no road signs in the dark. Well, if you could help me, just think who I could be. I'm reaching out. Is there someone reaching back to me? When I feel alone, all I see is red. A million screams going through my head. All these walls we build to live. Sharing ain't my strongest suit, but I'll do my best and open up to you. If you think it will make a difference, and if you could help me, just think who I could be. I'm reaching out, and I need you reaching back to me. Say it's not my fault that everything that's happened can turn beautiful. If you weren't here, how could I find the light out there? I'm looking for it, looking for the light. Just say you will help me, and say you will help me, 'cause I'm reaching out, and I need you reaching back to me. I'm reaching out, and I need you reaching back to me.
Thanks for working together to get from Mila to millions.